You can't fight this beat. We're taking it higher and higher. Let go, just groove. Get up on your feet, come on. Let the melody take over. You can't fight this beat. We're taking it higher and higher. Let go, just groove. Get up on your feet, come on. Let the melody take over. You can't fight this beat. We're taking it higher and higher. Let go, just groove. Just give it up. Dance. I'm telling you.
Get started in 1 minute. We're gonna let the musicians take us to the break. Such a beautiful song to get us going and get us in the mood for another amazing evening for some of us. I'm on the East Coast to have an amazing conversation, recovering a legacy that needs to be recovered, that needs to be shared, and that is Maida Springer KEMP. So welcome to another edition of the Radical Black Women series. My name is Chris Rogers, and I am the program director at the Paul Robeson House and Museum. The Radical Black Women series is brought to you in a collaboration between the Paul Robeson House and Museum in Philly. We also have the Claudia Jones School for Political Education in DC. Thank you, Dante O'Hara, for helping out with the tech and getting the message out to your folks out there in DC. And also, we have the wonderful team at Black Women Radicals. We're so glad to have Jamie Swift on the call with us today, who will be helping us to live tweet, so you can, follow the tweets and engage Black Women Radicals on Twitter. So keep an eye out. The conversation will be unfolding there as well. We thank everyone who is, joining us on Zoom. And then for those who may not have access to Zoom, we're also, streaming this out to YouTube, where the conversation will also be archived. So we're so grateful to our contributors who are here for today. And I'm excited to get started. So without further ado, let's get into today's event. And I have some words that I have here to kind of introduce us. And I just want to give a shout out to Paul Prescott, because Paul's contribution to Jacobin was what got this whole conversation started. So let me go ahead with my little script. Over the summer, Paul Prescott offered these words in Jacobin. Maida Springer isn't a household name, even among trade unionists and labor historians, but she was a lifelong union member and organizer who was committed to using unions to improve Black people's lives in the United States and Africa. And we are so thankful to have Dr. Yevette RIchards on hand to talk about Maida Springer after publishing her biography in a book of extended conversations. And we'll make sure to have those links available for folks who want to, pick up that work and get in tune. But Dr. RIchards' books explores the ways in which pan-Africanism, racism, sexism, and anti-Communism affected Maida Springer's political development, her labor activism, and her relationship with labor leaders in the AFL-CIO, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, and in African unions. Springer's life experiences and work reveal the complex nature of Black struggles for equality and justice. A strong supporter of both the AFL-CIO and the ICFTU, Springer nonetheless recognized that both organizations were fraught with racism, sexism, and ethnocentrism. She also understood that charges of communism were often used as a way to thwart Black demands for social justice. As an African American, she found herself in the unenviable position of promoting to Africans the ideals of American democracy, from which she was excluded from fully enjoying. And beyond Maida Springer as organizer, as a transnational labor figure, we are so grateful to have with us tonight Christina Springer, Maida's granddaughter, and also a Pittsburgh-based artist. So extremely thankful for you for helping making this possible tonight, being the connector and the bridge that your grandmother once was as well, to have us have a rich dialogue tonight. So I'm going to read each one of their bios, and then we'll get started with tonight's conversation. Granddaughter to Maida Springer, Christina Springer is an alt.Black artist who uses text, performance, video, and other visual expressions to communicate what the space between molecules in the air wish for you to know. She has published 4 collections of poetry, most recently The Splooge Factory, through Frayed Edge Press in 2018. The 21B Choir will premiere a new commissioned text work, Praise Song for Tulsa, in April at the African American Museum in Oakland, California. Be on the lookout for that. Her most recent mixed media project, Futuristic Relics and Motherboard Sacred, has shown in galleries nationally. Springer is also the founder and designer from Yes, which offers Black womanist lifestyle objects. Dr. Yevette RIchards is a specialist in African American history, US women's history, labor studies, and pan-Africanism. She has published Maida Springer, Pan-Africanist and International Labor Leader, the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2000, and the oral history companion book entitled Conversations with Maida Springer, A Personal History of Labor, Race, International Relations, which came out in 2004 through University of Pittsburgh Press. And we're also thankful to Paul Prescott, who was a contributor to Jacobin magazine, a high school social studies teacher right here in our neighborhood of Philadelphia, and a member of the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers. He's most recently publicly launched his campaign for the PA State Senate to represent the 8th District. Thank you, Paul, for being here with us tonight. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. And with that, let's just jump into these questions. And I really want to begin with a foundation by reaching out to you, Christina, and thinking, beyond the transnational labor organizing. Could you tell us about who your grandmother was to you? And what was like family life? What were the type of stories she would share about her experiences? And how did that leave an impact on you? So if you could just really ground us in who your grandmother was, and Maida Springer is a full human being.
I guess I'd like to start with the fact that I'm so grateful to be included, because it is so important to see, when possible, historical figures in their fullest context. And my grandmother was one of the warmest, most gracious, loving, soft, humble people I've ever experienced in my life. And when I was younger, many of my peers rolled their eyes when they had to see their grandparents. And I totally did not get that, because my grandparents, all of them, including her mother and even her mother's mother, who I had an opportunity to meet and go to her 100 and something birthday party, were warm, fabulous, interesting people who really loved children. And I think that's so important to remember when we think about her. is that she was also a mother. And more importantly, she was a very loving mother. And she appreciated seeing children. She appreciated hearing children. She really integrated children into her life. And I think that shows up in some of her labor work as well, because she was always very concerned about the children. Especially, I remember her telling me tales of young little girls in India being hired for their small fingers to do fine needlepoint, and it weighed on her heart tremendously. As a youngster, my grandmother didn't share much of her work experience. It was almost as if I had to grow into knowing her work. And I remember very clearly being a small child, and she had just returned from, I must have been Tanzania. And she had brought me and my mother the most gorgeous matching African dresses. And it occurred to me to ask her, like, she always was bringing me these wonderful things from far off places. And it occurred to me suddenly at that point to ask her, what was she doing? Why was she always going somewhere exciting for work? And more specifically, what kind of work was that? And I remember so clearly, and this stayed with me for such a long time. She just smiled and she said, "Oh, I don't do very much. I mostly have dinner parties and talk to people." And I thought, wow, that's so cool. Like, you can grow up and be a kind of person who has dinner parties and talk to people, and so many people admire you and respect you. And it wasn't until I was a young woman that I began to understand what exactly talking to people meant. But she was humble like that, and she was so gracious like that, and so soft-spoken. And in many ways, my family left work at the workplace, and at home we spoke of ideas on our own time. And my parents, like my grandmother, centered their non-working hours around the table. And the table was the place where great philosophical and political discussions were had. And we talked about some pretty heady stuff around the dinner table, from civil rights to African liberation movements and women's equality, and of course, issues of class. And we always had company at our table. And in fact, I believe my grandmother frequently sent young Africans who were studying at Pitt to our table. So they would join us for Sunday dinner, they would join us for Thanksgiving or Christmas. Our house was always full of interesting people, usually sent by her or people my parents themselves had collected along the way. And at this table, you could say anything you wanted to say, but you had to back it up with sources. And even to this day, my son will look at someone and say congenially, "Well, cite your sources," as if that is how one converses with other people who are having a discussion about some sort of philosophical or historical or any matter whatsoever. And the other thing growing up is we were keenly aware of labor issues, and not in a way that everyone was saying the labor movement, the labor movement. It was just something that was part of our lives. And I remember being at a friend's house during the United Farm Workers strike. And I was a pain in the neck back then. I still kind of am. And my friend's mother was serving grapes. And in our house, we support workers. And I told that friend's mother all about why she should not be buying or eating grapes, and that the people who only cared for their own selfish convenience ate grapes. And I don't believe I was ever invited back to that house, and I actually didn't really care. And so I guess what I'm trying to say in this long rambling thing is that we lived very much in our beliefs, and because she lived very much in her beliefs, in the same way that her mother lived very much in her beliefs. And we didn't talk about them so much as except to communicate with others when they were challenged, when our beliefs were challenged, when our rights were challenged. And this came up again and again. And there are just so many stories about the way she lived and made a family value of the union and the union cause, that caring for human beings, for people, and especially the children, were just a way in which you lived your life. So that's the sort of long and short of it.
That was beautiful. That was so beautiful. So thank you for like bringing us into the house, into the living room, onto the dinner table. That was such a wonderful like introduction. It's kind of like maybe two connections, and I'm looking to you, Dr. Richards, to kind of help us, because Christina, you talked about like the importance of family and her mother and her mother's mother, and those influences. You know, one of the things that's mentioned is the relationship to like the Garvey's UNIA, you know, early within her childhood. I'm wondering, you know, Dr. Richards, if you could speak to like those influences. And I also, you know, after Dr. Richard goes, I also want to look at you, Paul, someone who's also, you know, Caribbean descendant, to think about like just the impact of Caribbean descendant labor organizers in this period. So I'll go to you first, Dr. Richards, about her, you know, family experience.
Hey, thank you, Chris. I'd just like to say I'm happy to be here with you, Paul and Christina, and also with the Claudia Jones School for Political Education. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk about Maida Springer, one of my favorite people in the world. I met her before I was even thinking about going to graduate school. I saw a picture postcard of her at a bookstore called Common Concerns. It's a left-wing bookstore in Washington, D.C. It no longer exists. It's near DuPont Circle. And they had postcards of every conceivable activist you could think of. And I saw hers. I'm like, who is this? You know, and I looked her up. I could find nothing about her. And when I went to graduate school, I found her. It took a while. And she invited me to Pittsburgh to her house. And Christina's exactly right. So hospitable. And I'm like, you don't know me. How can you invite me to stay in your house? And we just talked for a long time about her work, her history. And she didn't want to write the book or write a book at that time. She said, yeah, people have told me, you know, but I don't know. I don't really want to do it. And I said, well, you know, you may not want to do it with me, but you have to write this down. You've led such a fascinating life. And she talked a little bit more, and then she decided she'd do it with me. So she talked herself into it. And so I would go to Pittsburgh and just have these long tape conversations with her that I have to get digitized. And we, you know, so she told me all about growing up in the Garvey movement. Her mother was a political person. And so her mother always took her to street corner orators. So she saw A. Philip Randolph, Frank Crossway, you know, you name it, whoever was up there talking about Black rights on a street corner on a soapbox with the American flag, she was there to listen and absorb, because her mother took her. She said, I went everywhere with my mother. And her mother became a Garveyite, was a Red Cross nurse. And she remembers going to church on Sundays, and then you spend the afternoon in the Church of Garvey. And I remember she said that one person who really stuck with her, besides Garvey, was Henrietta Vinton Davis, who was a marvelous orator and elocutionist. Before she even met Garvey, I think she was about 20 years older than Garvey. And she was very loyal to the movement. And unfortunately, Garvey kind of kicked her to the curb when he was when he got kicked out of the United States. He kind of sort of attacked all of the people who had supported him before. But she stayed loyal to the principles of Garveyism and went to the rival Garvey organization. And so I had heard about Henrietta Vinton Davis. So to hear Maida Springer talk about seeing her speak was amazing for me. She also was very close to two other women in the labor movement as she joined the labor movement. One was Dolly Lothar Robinson, and the other one was Charlotte Edelman. And they were both out of the Laundry Workers Union. And Charlotte Edelman was from Trinidad, and she was a Garveyite. Later on, she became close to George McCrae, who worked in Africa, and his family grew up in the Garveyite movement. So there are all these interconnections that people have, you know, in their formative years of political mobilization that they bring with them forward. So she would march. She marched in Garvey parades. You know, later on, she marched in A. Philip Randolph's contract parade in 1937, and she took her little boy, Christina's father, to that parade. So yeah, she said wherever her mother went, she was active politically and saw all of the Black leaders in Harlem, who were just outraged about the conditions that Black people face in the United States with lynching and discrimination and exclusion, lack of jobs, so she was politicized at a very early age.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Richards. And coming to you, Paul, to kind of, there's such a rich legacy of, Caribbean, Americans, first generation or Caribbean immigrant labor organizers that, both like predate this like period, but also like continue through that. I wonder, as someone who I look up to as someone who, lifts up the history of, Black and Pan-African labor organizing, you could speak to like just what's happening there that so many, Caribbean people are becoming to take up leadership in so much of these labor union spaces. What is it about that legacy that is helping to create that, platform and use these skills and wisdom to impact the world?
Yeah, and again, first, I just want to say, thanks for having me. And Dr. Richards, you definitely have to digitize those tapes as soon as possible, please. So I just want to say that first. But yeah, and I think one thing interesting I read, like, in reading Dr. Rich's work is, Maida talking about that there actually being big divides between, Caribbean communities and African-American communities in the United States. And I think when it comes to the labor organizing part, I think there's kind of like a structural factor here, being that because, African-Americans by and large in this period are being banned from, being a part of trade unions. So a lot of them not having real trade union, labor union organizing experience, whereas in the West Indies and throughout the Caribbean, I think more people are coming to the United States with that background and with that kind of know-how and kind of perspective on class. And I think there was also something different with the experience of being in the majority in a West Indian country, still, of course, facing racial discrimination, but organizing as a working class where you're the majority, as opposed to the United States being in the minority and not being allowed into the trade union. So I think that's why, we kind of get this element of so many West Indian immigrants kind of lighting the torch in terms of trade union organizing. And, there were certain unions like the oil field workers in Trinidad were extremely strong, even going back to the 1920s, and kind of bringing that experience with them. And I think you even see this, I'm kind of jumping ahead historically, but even after independence, whereas, it's kind of a different context where you're, in the majority and at all levels of society, you have a Black ruling class, a Black middle class, and a Black working class, as opposed to the United States where, the class lines are more drawn along race. And I just kind of want to say as well, like, it's interesting that like Maida is influenced early on by the Garvey movement, although, when she really starts going politically, you could say like she's really kind of taken a route that is kind of opposed to the Garvey movement, like, more aligned with Randolph. But I think still just it kind of spoke to, she grew up in a very vibrant political culture where it's like, okay, she might have wound up not really agreeing with Garvey that much, but like all these currents were around her when she was young. And I think that's just better for all of us to be exposed to different political perspectives at a young age, even if you don't agree with all of them. And, and I think this kind of speaks to what Christina was saying about, like labor, whether it's labor or any kind of political movement being a part of your social life. So, she's licking envelopes for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters at a neighbor's house, as a little girl, that kind of just ingrains in you a certain experience. And I think that's part of the problem we have today is there's just less and less people who even know anyone in a union or, to have that kind of experience to know why it's important.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. And I think one of the things that you talked like the vibrant political currents of the time. And I think one of the parts that I really get is Maida's experience in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, and really shaping it to be a vibrant cultural force. And what's emphasized there is not just like that it was a space of, you know, mobilizing around particular, you know, workplace complaints and changes that need to be made, but it was also a space of like political education and cultural trips and cultural explorations and other activities that help to inform the ability to organize, to build a base and build a mass. So Dr. Richards, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Maida's shaping of the ILGWU and like how all those activities and the different strategies that it took to really like increase the impact of their work.
Yes. So, you know, she said she was on fire with the labor movement. You know, once she became a member, there was no turning back. And so she tried to get all the education she could. And Frank Crosswaith and A. Philip Randolph were leaders in the Negro Labor Committee, and they had a school in Harlem. And so she would always go to that school. And one of the people she learned from was Eddie Welch, who would later work for the ICFTU in East Africa. And he organized all over the world. He organized for the CIO in Panama. He organized for the ILGWU at that time. So education was a huge part of the cultural ferment. And she took whatever classes she could. And she said that they wanted her to join in musicals. Like they had a big hit, a Broadway hit called Pins and Needles. And it was the only union play that ever made it to Broadway, I think. And she said, just because I'm Black doesn't mean I can sing and dance. I can do neither. But they just thought, oh, you're going to be good at this. She's like, no, I'm not. But she saw education as a way of bringing workers together to see their common struggle. She didn't necessarily think, of course, she knew racism was a strong current within the labor movement, but, a speech by Randolph convinced her that there was great value in trying to organize across race lines in order to uplift workers. And so, she saw education as one way of doing that. And Hudson Shore Labor School was located across the river from Franklin Roosevelt's Hyde Park. And so she would take workers there to, they would relax, get to know each other, talk about union struggles. And part of the way you build cohesion and solidarity is for people to get to know one another. But she would sometimes have to convince these racist parents to let their daughters go to Hudson Shore Labor School because they, these immigrants are coming here, and they quickly pick up on the Black beast myth that if there are two Black men up there, then their daughters are in danger, And so she would, in her firm, quiet way in which she never lost her self-respect, let them know that they were wrong, and that and then she would also turn the tables and let them know how they were affected by prejudice in their own countries. So she was very effective at building avenues for understanding without allowing any of the racism to undermine her in a way that made her feel that she had lost her self-respect, or people didn't respect her. She never allowed that to happen. And one of the things she did at Hudson Shore Labor School during the 1940s was take the students there to go see a Father Divine Heaven that was next door. There was a man who hated Franklin Roosevelt, who decided to sell his property because he had he couldn't afford it anymore. And he deliberately sold it to Father Divine. A lot of people who sold their property didn't do so knowingly to Father Divine. And so he wanted to embarrass Franklin Roosevelt by having, by him having all these Black neighbors during this, time of keen segregation and discrimination. And so she took them to see the Father Divine home. And I said, well, why would you do that? What was your purpose? She said, well, I just wanted them to see for themselves, as opposed to what they read in the newspapers, what was going on. So she was always about educating people to have their own experiences and not rely on what other people told them. So there were all these rumors out about how Father Divine was a crazy, she believed it was a cult, but what was written in the newspapers was far different from how they behaved. And so she just wanted to jar them, to let them see that there was that there was this difference. So she was always seeking opportunities for people to learn. And I remember once reading, she was coming back from Africa, and she's going to be hosting a delegation from Guinea during the March on Washington. And some people in the labor department were upset. They're like, what if they want to go south? What will we do? And so they asked her when she came in, and she said, well, let them go. It's better for them to see for themselves than to just rely on whatever their imagination tells them. So she was never about hiding anything. She was always about, exposure and coming to your own conclusions.
Yeah. And Christina, I see you were nodding your head around that moment of like the warm, gentle invitations, as well as like those spaces of going to see it for yourself. And I'm thinking back into like those family examples where there are moments that you felt like, I'm being organized into something and I don't know, like, or that sort of, relationship happens of like those discoveries.
I would have to say, I'm nodding my head yes so much, because I'm always hearing her. I envisioned myself when I was younger, and I guess I still do a little bit, as quite the radical, and I was also very politically active, and same as Maida was marched to all the Garvey events. I was marched out for all the political events, and I think I was 6 years old the first time I was handing out political flyers for a city council. A Black woman was running for Pittsburgh City Council, and I'm 6, talking the issues on the street, handing out the pamphlets to everybody, encouraging them to vote. And so something that always happened, I would come to her with something I thought was just outrageous, and undeniably strange and new. And I came out to her as queer, and she just was like, yes, you're not the first. You are not the last. There's nothing particularly interesting about that. What did you learn at school this year? Or and she'd bring it around to the ideas. And there were other things where I would say, I think X and Y should happen. And she'd say, well, how do you know? And she was always questioning, how do you know that? Well, I know it because of this. And, well, but where did you get that information from? And she was always drawing you into your own self-revelation, often to the point where you were you were realizing that you were not you had not had the epiphany that you had quite had, and that you needed to begin over with some better data. And so, but it was always so loving, and so with that, but how do you know? And what do you think is so extraordinarily special about that? And what are you going to achieve when you march through the streets or whatever? And what is the objective? What are your demands? Do you have demands? How is that going to change things?
Oh, man.
But there was nothing interesting about, and I remember for National Coming Out Day, it was like, well, that's interesting. And exactly what do you expect to happen when everybody discusses their bedroom? And I said, well, visibility. She says, well, and what does visibility, and so it was drawing you out until you're actually really thinking, what is the mission? What are the goals that we are hoping to achieve What practices are going to be put into place? What tangible are we going to build? And so that's how I've always thought of organizing, even from those early young college days, of what is the mission? How are we going to accomplish it? And what tangible result are we going to achieve? And how is it going to make the world a better place? But it was so gentle.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that story, those stories. And switch gears just a little bit, because, and I saw this in one of your articles, Dr. Richards, of sort of like interrogating and analyzing sort of like the blanket American anti-communism of that period, and how Maida was navigating her way through trade union organizing. And I want to ask, both you and Paul, you contribute to this question of, could you talk about like what experiences or events may have shaped Maida's perception of the Communist Party organizing at a time when she's leading these very successful trade union campaigns, thinking of the 30s and the 40s in particular. And while we know her critiques, was there an evolution of her perspective over time?
So I think that, she came from a very radical union. And so there were people who were a range of political persuasions. But by the time she came to the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, those who had been communists in that union had split into the Lovestonites and the communists. And the Lovestonites called themselves the true communists, right, at first. But before she even met some of the white Lovestonites, she had known black Lovestonites, and they had tried to proselytize her. She liked them, but she never joined their groups. Like I said, Eddie Welch was a black Lovestonite, and then there was another guy, I remember she said, who would always proselytize her. And so I think that, and then later on she met Charles Zimmerman, who was the head of her Local 22, and he kind of took her under his wing and helped to promote her leadership. And she's good friends with Jenny Silverman, a woman I had met who came from the Ukraine, had to escape a pogrom, and has a magnificent story of survival. And Minnie Lurie, whose brother was killed by gangsters in New York for organizing. So she was friends with all of these people who were, very much committed to the labor movement. And communists would come by her home on Sundays. She said, always on Sundays when I'm trying to get my work done, and try to bring her into the movement. But she just didn't believe that they had the formula for changing America. She just didn't believe it. She's like, it's a beautiful story, I don't believe it. And she also, I think, was resentful that they could find nothing good about the union, right? Unless they controlled it and could put their people in positions of power. So she didn't find that very credible either, that you think that everything's rotten, and so, but and she was friends with A. Philip Randolph, who was a socialist and his, had very strong anti-communist beliefs. But I wouldn't call them cold warriors. They just were not pro-communist. They realized how the Red Scare was used to try to undermine Black rights. And they also realized how horrible the United States looked internationally with all of the suppression of Black people's rights and Black people's dignity. But at the same time, they did not think that what they felt were people who followed principally behind the Soviet Union had a better plan for Black liberation. So, but because this was a period of the Cold War, they were caught up in all these struggles. But she had tremendous respect for W.E.B. Du Bois for Paul Robeson. She would never come out against those people, but she was not someone who felt that the communists had the answer at all. And interestingly, in her international work, the communist, anti-communist, pro-communist split happened in Africa as well. And there were some who were genuinely neutral, wanted to be neutralists. And so the labor movement, the African international labor movement split over these Cold War ideologies. And she said to me once, about the Cold War in Africa, she said, what I found is that Africans wore every one ideology on their sleeve lightly, but there was a strong feeling against the West because of colonialism. But it is interesting that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, is now the International Trade Union Confederation, has a woman general secretary and a Nigerian man president. So you see this, large transformation in the leadership of the international trade union movement once we get rid of this Cold War divide. And that just was not really possible when they're fighting colonialism back in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, thank you for that. And kind of going to Paul, I'll even just to restate, is just how is, red baiting, government repression really affecting the landscape for Black labor leaders during this period? And particularly thinking of I know the sort of, the erasure and the repression that Robeson went through and others, and thinking of today's labor politics and how many of these same sort of anti-communist or these anti-international rhetorics still sort of affect labor organizing today. So just wanted to restate the question.
Yeah. And I think I might start kind of a little bit on the previous question and move in, but and I think it's very complicated. I think we kind of have to be able to hold two ideas at once. And I think on the one hand, to me, I think it's pretty clear and undeniable that, of the unions of the 30s and 40s, the ones that were communist led or heavily influenced by communists were among the best at fighting for racial justice, both inside and outside the workplace. I think that's pretty clear. At the same time, these, the Communist Party had a reputation both among moderates and even other kinds of leftists, such as socialists like A. Philip Randolph, of, people believing that at the end of the day, they were more loyal to whatever the foreign policy imperatives of the Soviet Union were than what was going on in the United States. And I think someone like Maida, there was the example of, during World War II, before, when Stalin and Hitler had an alliance, US communists were against the US entering World War II. Now, all of a sudden, when the alliance breaks, they do an about face and are supportive of the war. So I think someone like Maida, if you're around people taking those positions, that kind of idea about what the Communist Party is kind of seems to ring true. And I think also kind of going back to the factionalism inside the union, and I've been part of internal union factional battles, and they can get pretty nasty. And so again, I think on a very practical level, if Maida had respect for the leadership of that union, and she's just seeing communists kind of attacking them and trying to remove them from leadership, that's probably going to affect her opinion of the Communist Party. And I think one other element, and I think this sometimes can relate to today, is I think she in a way kind of felt tokenized by the Communist Party. I think her line was they loved her too much. And I sometimes say half jokingly, even today, I mean, sometimes white leftists can end up being so anti-racist, they end up being racist. And what I mean by that is the feeling of you're tokenizing someone, or you're only talking to someone, or you only want to organize with someone because they're Black. And I think that was kind of the tension. Again, on the one hand, the Communist Party was doing things in the Black community, other mainly white leftist groups weren't. There could be some context where that could come off maybe as tokenizing, or they're trying to use Black people for a certain end. So I think it was pretty complicated. But Yeah, I mean, I think how it's kind of affecting the climate at the time. Again, it's like this double bind of like whatever criticisms we have of the Communist Party. Again, they were doing, I think, some pretty groundbreaking stuff for racial justice in the labor movement. And so you're caught in this bind where, the people like A. Randolph are also called communists, even though they're not. They're pretty explicitly not. But just because they're trying to do anything about racial justice in their labor movement. So I think it gets a lot of people caught up in this kind of divide. And I think I had something here I want to make sure I said. I think even today, like, how does this limit our horizons? And I think, many unions are still stuck in the mindset that ultimately won out during the Cold War. And I think that was the idea that, labor can bargain over wages and benefits, but it should not deal with the fundamental questions of power in the society and the economy. Like, labor should not question capitalist right to manage production, to set priorities. They should not be concerned with like the broader society. And I think, again, we saw this with Maida, even in a non-communist union, part of her involvement in the union was not just about raising wages. Like, that's important, but it was about broadening the horizons of working people and getting involved in the society. But I think the Cold War mindset kind of limited what unions think of what they should be doing. And I think, even this idea of building alliances with community was kind of lost during those Cold War years. And I think accepting certain arrangements as inevitable. So accepting that, we can't have a national healthcare system. The best we can hope for is that unions can bargain for healthcare through their employer. I think that was a Cold War mindset that they have accepted. And I think a lot of this had to do with, the literal repression of the actual people, like the physical removal of the people that had these ideas of broadening the scope of the labor movement, the ideas of like, making it more concerned with racial justice. Like, these people were literally purged and removed on a large scale. And I think, it's kind of one of these what if questions historically. Like, if that did not happen, I wonder how the labor movement might have related to the civil rights movement in the 60s and afterwards. The labor movement was involved, but I wonder how that could have looked differently, or even how would it have related to the anti-Vietnam War movement if a lot of those radicals were not purged from those unions and from leadership. So I think those are just some things I'm thinking about, how that kind of Red Scare is even affecting us today.
I will say too that, she was very much influenced by George Padmore, who was purged from the Communist International because he was critical of the Soviet Union, what he thought they were going soft on their criticism of colonial powers because they wanted to ally with colonial powers. So, she became very close to him as well. So she's surrounding herself by people who've been disillusioned with the Communist Party, either in the United States or internationally. So that in itself is not going to, it's going to be a wall between her and people who are in the Communist Party, who want her to come on their side, because she's already linked up with these other people.
And if I could add another thing, and this might be kind of an elephant in the room for some people, but we do know now that the AFL-CIO, which is the main labor federation in the United States, had been collaborating with the CIA in various activities in Africa and around the world in an anti-communist way. But it seems to me, from what I've read about Maida, like, Maida was not the person like directing those activities or collaborating. And I think in so many instances throughout Africa, like, her goal was like, how do I get through the sectarian mess to offer actual practical help to trade unions in Africa? That seemed to be her goal, and not wanting to get stuck in the cold. Yes, she had her opinions about communism, but she was not the agent of the CIA throughout Africa. She was really just trying to figure out how best she could help unions, in different African countries.
Yeah, she said, you can't travel in that world and not be aware that something was happening. But she, and there was money flowing from the Soviet Union as well, backing their people. But she was, it's interestingly, she was always trying to find a way to promote African labor, what they wanted. But sometimes, you know, there are just battles over power, right? And so the easiest way for you to undermine your opponent is to say they're part of, you know, this vast wing conspiracy. And so people who were friendly with her one day, you know, the next day would be saying that the person that she's still friends with is undermining African labor. And then, so I found this in much of my research, people would just take these things at face value. And she would be put in Africa in times when she wasn't there and said to be delivering money. And I could see by her itinerary that she's not there. So there was, you know, so she was trapped up in a lot of that Cold War fighting. But what I saw when I was able to go to East Africa too, in the late 1980s, I guess around 1990 with her. And so I saw some of the old Whigs she had been friends with, you know, when they were, and they're now old men. And the level of respect for her is, I mean, you just see it. It's not fake. You know, they think the world of her. They thought, you know, you came here at a time and you were able to listen to us and get our ideas out of Africa at a time when we could not depend on anyone. We had the colonial powers, the labor unions from the colonial powers in our way, and you helped to translate our needs. Even though some of them later on, as their countries became independent, they became heads of the labor department, and the labor unions became subsumed under the government. And at that point, the AFL-CIO was more critical, like you can't have labor federations that are arms of the government, of a one-party state. But she still remained friends with them, and she wanted to make leeway, like, you know, let them make their mistakes. You've made all your mistakes, you know. But it was very hard. But it's interesting to see her go back later in 1990, and you know, they still have this very strong bond with one another, and that can't be faked, you know. So in spite of all of those Cold War tensions, she had carried a great level of respect among women too, African women that she worked with, and you know, so they would tell me stories. I remember one story a woman told me was that there was a woman who's being very disruptive in the union. And she said, I can't do anything to please her. She's always just trying to tear down the union. And Maida said, give her a major responsibility and let her run with it. And it worked. You know, so make her invested in the movement. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there, that there was that, and she also wanted at one point to move to Africa before the 1965 Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act was passed. She was seriously thinking about just, I'm going to East Africa, I'm giving up citizenship, like Du Bois, but in the end she decided to stay, but she was that close to moving away from the United States.
I love that you shared that story about, you know, how to organize someone who might be disruptive, particularly thinking of Paul's experience as a high school social studies teacher and knowing that I've played that game many a times. I was like, oh, you want to lead? We're going to give you a space.
Pass out papers, you know.
Christina, I want to come back to you because we're talking about the international, you know, context. And I really loved, and you talked about it kind of early about like the people who would show up to the dinner table and the type of conversations you were at. Could you talk more about how you perceive Maida's vision of pan-Africanism, and like how that showed up in like your life, in the family life?
I don't know that there was a that that's a good one, because it wasn't until Yvette's book came out that I really viewed my grandmother as a pan-Africanist. Africa was part and parcel of who she was, and for me, I growing up on the cusp of integration in an era of Tarzan movies and bug-eyed representations of superstitious savages. I mean, I grew up in a time when white people, according to the textbook, saved Black people by enslaving them, and they were so kind to have saved us because now we had shoes and clothing and Jesus. And so, growing up in that era, with her deep and meaningful knowledge of Africa, with her placing African guests at our holiday tables. And she always brought back stunning examples of African arts and cultures, the textiles and the wonderful dresses, and my parents have a beautiful African arts. My parents have a beautiful African arts collection, thanks to her, thanks to gifts that she had been given, or so I always viewed us as connected to Africa, especially in relation to the extremely toxic levels of whiteness in my school and social life. I knew who I was and where I came from and why I was special, and more importantly, perhaps even better than. And so that African sensibility, I think, was part of her, but I also think it was part of her mother, and I think it was part of her mother's mother. I think it goes back. I think they retained so many of their Africanisms, and that is why she was so effective on the continent as a whole, was that it was not culturally alien to her in many respects. And so I think so that's, I think, how her influence of Pan-Africanism affected us as a family. But I think it was, we had never individuated from, we had never lost that sense, or she maintained that sense in the household of that Africa was just was the beginning of our story, and our story was not bound to this continent. Our story was not bound to the United States. Our story was larger and more expansive and quite beautiful. So that
was a wonderful way.
That's what I got growing up.
Yes. Paul, were you about to come on?
Yeah, just want to jump in and like what really kind of interested me about Maida's kind of vision of Pan-Africanism was, like, I think she was very concerned with the actual concrete details of like what would a transition to independence look like, and I think her vision was kind of mirrored her vision of what she wanted to happen in the United States. So like she wanted, strong democratic unions to have a leading role in setting policy for the nation, and she didn't want it to be determined by the Cold War. And I think her role was, what practical resources can I give to workers and organizations to help this happen? And as Dr. Richards mentioned before, like I think she was disturbed by the trend of unions in Africa kind of being subsumed underneath the state. And I think this was like a very complicated question for these countries in the process of decolonizing, because the independence movements before achieving independence were multi-class, where the working classes, middle classes, and the elites all had an interest in ending colonization. And I think there's the pressure in that situation to kind of close ranks around the new independent government. But I think what we found is then, as soon as independence was achieved, those same class conflicts then, they didn't go anywhere, and this idea that we're all kind of in the same project together kind of gets more complicated. And so I think, you know, she believed that these unions needed to remain independent and like, you know, they had a big determining role in what should go on next. And I think her vision was, again, some kind of version of whether you want to call it social democracy or democratic socialism. Like, I think that was the path she was hoping for in Africa, you know, to not go communist, but she was very clear, like, you know, she did not want capitalism essentially to reign throughout Africa. So I think she was kind of, I don't want to use the word third way because that has a different connotation, but a different path, you know, for Africa.
Dr. Richards, do you have, if not, I can.
Yeah, so, yeah, I like what both of you said. I remember I was telling her about a friend of mine who was having a hard time, you know, or at least he's working for this, contractor firm that was hugely exploiting the workers, you know, over their wages. And she just shook her head and she said, if I were 20 years younger. So she always had that fight in her to, you know, empower workers to, you know, so that they could take charge of their destiny and their livelihood, you know, and have a say in, you know, in having fair treatment. And so, you know, she just felt that the labor movement gave her so much. And she was so disappointed that much of the labor movement started to decline, you know, especially in the 70s. And so she would just shake her head because she joined the labor movement in the 30s when it was so vibrant and everybody was so ecstatic and everyone knew what was at stake, what they didn't have before versus what they were obtaining, you know, shorter hours, you know, vacations, weekends. And we've seen so much of that eroded. And the propaganda is out there that workers shouldn't have those things, you know, that we should be happy with 2 weeks vacation a year, you know, that we should be happy with healthcare that's tied to the job so that if you lose your job, then that's your fault somehow and you have to be without healthcare, you know. So she was very, you know, always had a love affair with the labor movement, she said, and she loved Africa, you know, that was just in her. And, you know, she said the first time she went to West Africa, she heard Anansi the spider tales. And she said the hair rose on the back of my neck because I was raised on those folk tales. And she said, and her colleagues told her, oh yeah, you're West African, you know, because she knew those tales. And, you know, she called Tom Mboya her second son, and Tom Mboya was a very controversial figure later on, partly because he was hugely successful and he outmaneuvered his opponents so well. And he was able to gain support in quarters where others were not. And she met him as a young man. She and Pauline Murray kind of took him under their wing when he first came to New York. And later on, though, he had to distance himself from the Americans because he was called an American. And so she saw that happening and it greatly saddened her. But he was responsible for the airlift, the Kenyan airlift that brought many Kenyans and then East Africans in general here to the United States for an education so that they could then take that training and go back and serve their independence governments. And Maida died in 2005, but one of the people who was brought over on those airlifts was Barack Obama Sr. And he went to Hawaii and made Barack Obama Jr. And he was, and I didn't realize, you know, I knew the story of Tom Mboya's assassination, but it's only later that I realized that this is Barack Obama Sr. The last person he saw was someone who was from his ethnic group, Barack Obama Sr., outside of a drugstore. They had a conversation. He was an economist. They had a conversation, and then he went into the drugstore and came back out, and that's when he was assassinated. So the last person he talked to was Barack Obama's father before he was killed. And I just think that I just look at these coincidences, and it's also interesting to know that this is off topic a little bit, but it was assumed that Barack Obama had no African American ancestry, but through his mother's line, there is one line that the Ancestry.com traced it that goes back to 1640 Virginia. And he's thought to be the 11th great grandson of John Punch, who was the first Black person in the British colonies who was punished with slavery, legally punished with slavery for running away. He ran away with 2 white indentured servants, and the indentured servants got longer terms, and he became a slave for life. And he cohabitated with a white woman. They had children. Some of those children became white, like Barack Obama's mother's line, and others remained Black. And one of those lines was Ralph Bunche's line, who won the Nobel Peace Prize along with Martin Luther King and Barack Obama. So, I just think all of these connections are just very, very interesting.
Yeah.
But that didn't come out until when he was president, and they did a genealogical search. But yeah, so his father was the last person to see Tom Mboya, and Maida Springer never knew. She died in 2005, so she wasn't able to make that connection.
Yes, thank you for that. And we're now time, just for everyone who's watching, we're now time for like open questions, and we're excited for folks to submit. I am keeping sort of like one final question towards the end, but I want to kind of turn towards audience questions now. And anyone, can speak to these, and actually says that in the question. So this question is from Jamie. It says, can anyone speak to Maida's consultancy with the Asian American Free Labor Institute and her work in Turkey and Indonesia?
Yeah, so she was asked to organize women in Turkey in the garment industry, to organize a women's committee that would be part of the garment workers union in Turkey. And so she went there for quite a while. I'm thinking it's 3 years before they were organized. And it was a terrific experience for her and for the women. They felt empowered, they felt heard, they had a conference, I believe, and were then organized into a women's branch of the Turkish Garment Workers Union. And she also went to Indonesia. She didn't feel as positive about that because of all the labor exploitation that happened, especially with young girls. But she did, try to organize there and try to find a way for leadership to develop amongst the women who were involved in textile trade in Indonesia.
Thank you for that. We have a great question from Kolo, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this correctly. But thank you so much for this conversation. I am curious if Paul Prescott and Dr. Richards could talk a little bit more about some consequences and ways forward. And Christina, I think you would be great to think about the arts as well. Ways forward for younger African students, workers wanting to join, re-educate, mobilize, strengthen labor organizing in their own surroundings or communities today. What they said about unions being subsumed by post-colonial governments really struck a chord for me as a South African listener. Shout out to people in South Africa listening to International. I know we had such strong union influence in overthrowing the apartheid regime, but these entities seem to be weakening today. So thinking about strengthening labor organizing, but I don't know if anyone could sort of speak to like what, contemporary sort of like, Pan-African or even just, home-based African labor organizing looks like today, and what are opportunities to continue to strengthen and build resolve and build connections.
I hesitate to really comment on in terms of the labor movements throughout Africa in terms of the present day context. I do know, I mean, there seems to have been some interesting things happen in South Africa. Actually, recently, I know with kind of different militant and more independent federations that are growing. And I do think this is really not the best answer to this question, but I think just a broad problem, and I think it kind of comes back to Maida's organizing, is like now more than ever, we need even more international solidarity because, I mean, in an ever more globalizing economy, I mean, we all know, I mean, they'll make one car and each part is made in a different part of the world to get to the lowest wages possible. And that makes it so much harder to organize. Like, you could strike in one part of the United States, but if they can still make it elsewhere, what do you do? And that's a really hard question. Like, no one has figured that out yet, but I know, I mean, it's not only hampering the labor movement in the United States, but I think even more so throughout Africa and, other parts of the global South. So I think that kind of speaks to the need, like, I mean, the efforts that they were doing that Maida was a part of the AFL-CIO, sending her to parts of Africa to build connections. I'll be honest, I don't know how much of that is still happening with the AFL-CIO. I'm sure there's some of it, but I think we really need a lot more so we can have like an actual international solidarity that actually means something concretely. That's like, I think a very urgent need.
Yeah, thank you. And I also, and thinking of like re-energizing, I know there's a lot that needs to be said about the power of the arts in terms of its relationship to movement building, to movement organizing. And I wonder, Christina, in particular, with your artistic practices, how do you think about the role of art in its relationship to movement building? And I think about, how maybe conversations with your grandmother or influences from your grandmother plays a role in that. I don't know if you could talk about that just a little bit.
I think, I mean, when we look at how society is constructed, it's so often reflected in the arts. You look at a lot of the early communist takeover of Russia, or you look at when Mao took over China, you saw the arts be subsumed and be turned into more propaganda. And I think being in alliance with artists to create, to shape the narrative is so important, because it gives it's a different way of messaging and communicating a system or a set of values. And I'm thinking of those great, I don't know if anyone else can call it up in their head, those posters and with the workers and the big hammers and all of that. But also artists tend to live on the fringe, and artists tend to be great critics of society, and mobilizing that kind of voice is becoming allied with this is a really hard question. I know in my own work, let me go back there. Let me start there rather than some sweeping, generalized thing. In my own work, and I think a large part influenced by my grandmother. In my own work, she is the one who got me started asking the question, what does utopia look like? How does utopia work? How does everyone get their needs met in a utopian society? What is the clothing like? What does the music sound like? And this ties into my piece that I've been working on lately called Futuristic Relics and Motherboard Sacred, where I'm actually envisioning this utopian future society. And all of those questions come into play when I redesign the technology, when I redesign the clothing, when I redesign the structure of cities, when I imagine how do we deal with waste systems. And all of those imaginings get put forward to an audience. In essence, art is propaganda. And who we are supporting as artists, or what artists we do support, is critical. Are we supporting the artists who are telling us that it's bitches and hoes and thug life and all of that? Or are we supporting artists who are giving us a vision for a better way of being in the world? And often the artists who are presenting more negative ideas about who we are as people are the ones that capitalism likes the best, because those are the ones that create a sense of longing and lack. If I just get this necklace, if I just get these shoes, if I just consume, then all of my life will work perfectly and it'll be just like it is in the music video. Whereas if we turn towards spectacular artists like Kehinde Wiley, and we look at ourselves as lush and royal, vibrant people, we're taking in a different sense of ourselves. And that is the way in which art can be employed and can connect to movements for social change, and more especially to workers. How do workers show up in the media we consume, or in the art we consume? Why don't we see beautiful imagery of working people? Those are questions that we need to ask ourselves as consumers of art, as the people who go to the museum. Why do we only have pictures of royalty hanging on the walls, or fancy people or ladies? Why aren't we seeing pictures of machinists? What are we not looking at? What are we turning our eyes away from? That is a role art can serve. Also, artists tend to speak out, and making sure that they have platforms to speak out on. In my last book, which was an examine of race and fetish, race, gender, class, and fetish on the sex industry. It was a book of poems, but I was critically looking at how society has commodified how we refuse to talk about race, how we refuse to address issues of gender, how we refuse, and in turn make them so unworthy of regular conversation that they have in turn become fetishized or become fetishes for people who have no other place to discuss it, no other safe place to go to have those discussions. So art has to do something. Thank you.
Christina, your discussion reminded me when you asked where are the workers' pictures, I was reminded of Paul LePage in Maine taking down the Diego Rivera murals, you know. No, we're not going to have that history for you to see. And I think that the question that was asked by the young person earlier about re-educating and mobilizing and what is to be done after, you know, a political movement is one, and it seems like, you know, workers are being left behind, or their organizations are weakening. And, you know, I cannot speak, you know, broadly because I'm not an expert in this, but I've seen, you know, some of what's happened in the United States is that people are organizing by communities, and especially organizing, you know, domestic workers, people who don't necessarily have a central workplace, but who are grossly exploited in this country, and empowering those groups by community organizing helps to expand the labor movement in, you know, beyond just the the worker in that particular industry. And there was a woman that Maida Springer loved. She's like, I love this woman. I forgot to tell you about it. Her, you need to write about it. Her name was Aura Lee Malone. And she was from St. Louis. And she's just now getting some attention in scholarship. But she was with, you know, she was a founding member. She was in with the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. She was a founding member of CLU and of I'm forgetting the name of the Black labor union, the Black organization. I'm forgetting the acronym, but she was a founding of that as well. Somebody should tell me. And she was also a proponent for voting rights. And on her, when she was sick in the hospital, they asked her, you know, what, do you have anything to say to us about, you know, what you think we should be doing in the future? And she said, you know, never give up the struggle for voting rights. Keep on working hard on that. And here we are in this age right now when voting rights is really imperiled. And all of her life, she saw the labor movement as bigger than just wages and work and conditions of work. She said, you know, there are problems with transportation, there are problems with healthcare. You know, if women can't get to work because they don't have reliable transportation, that is a burden to them. So she had a very holistic view of what the labor movement should be working on. And I think that's, you know, that's a direction that we need to go into, that there's organizing that's to be done, not just in the workplace, but outside the workplace to support the whole person.
Yeah, so I think we might have time for 2 questions. And I see one here from Dante. Dante asks, could you ask if Maida had any relationship to Black communist organizers? Like people like Ferdinand Smith or Jack O'Dell, or people organizing domestic workers like Esther Cooper Jackson. And I think that even speaks to, there was a great story who, you know, these people may not identify as communists, but like also like Mary McLeod Bethune and Una Marson. And you also mentioned Pauli Murray. So I would love to, you know, one, around this question of relationships directly with like Black communist organizers, people who were, you know, navigating that tension during that time. But also I would love to hear about like mentorship amongst Black women in the movement and how, you know, those relationships across countries really are being formed.
Yeah, so I don't know. She didn't mention any type of relationship with Black present communists, but with Black former communists, yes, but not with as far as working with Black communist leaders. They weren't in the same circles. And so her mentors were a lot of, you know, they were widespread. You know, she learned from so many people, both in this country and in the Pan-African circles in England. Jomo Kenyatta is the one who encouraged her to make sure that the American labor movement knew something about the struggles of Africa for independence, because they knew all about everybody else's struggles in the world, you know, because it was a union full of immigrants. But she realized they knew nothing about the struggle for independence from Africa or the Caribbean. And so she made that her mission to bring those voices to the labor movement. And she met George Padmore and Jomo Kenyatta and Ross McConan because she went to England on an exchange trip that she almost pulled out of. She said, I was too hot-blooded to put up with discrimination like that. She came down to DC and to prepare for this trip, along with 3 white women who were chosen as an exchange trip of labor women to England. And she found out she wasn't staying in the same hotel because Washington was segregated and didn't allow Black people in the hotel. They never told her that. They just put her at Bethune House, at Mary McLeod Bethune's residence. She couldn't get a taxi. She couldn't get around. She couldn't get, coffee to warm up, in a cheap 5 and dime. And she had said, I'm ready to go. I don't care. I'm done with this trip. I'm not going on it. And her picture had been blown up all over in the papers about how there's this Black woman, the first Black woman to go on this labor exchange trip to England. And we're so proud, and America is making rapid gains in race relations. And she's like, I'm not going to do it. And Bethune had a talk with her, and she said, I felt like I had done something wrong after Bethune got done with me. And basically what Bethune told her was that she had an opportunity to get something out of this that might be of importance to her and to Black people in the United States. And if she just didn't do it, then she would never know. She would lose that opportunity. So she put it in terms of, it's what you make of your resentment that is important. And so if she said, I talked to myself and had a conversation with myself, and I went on that trip, and the world of pan-Africanism opened up to her. So, Bethune had no way of knowing what exactly would come of it, but it completely changed her life in a way that wouldn't have happened if she had just, run back up to New York and gotten satisfaction from telling the US government, no, you aren't going to use me as as an icon of improved race relations while I'm being treated like this in the nation's capital.
Yes, thank you for that. And talk about yes, that and the importance of those moments, those, conversations that always, that most of the time don't get documented, that open up new worlds and new vistas for the folks who do this work. So really thankful for that. And kind of heading into our last question of today, while we have you all. And I'll kind of begin with Paul, but I'll just name the question. As we come to a close, we're really coming out as what's been, labeled or deemed Striketober, in regards to seeing a resurgence in labor organizing, domestically and abroad. As we sort of move forward, what lessons from Maida Springer's organizing would you like to leave people with to be useful in reviving a leftist global labor movement culture today?
Yeah, I think what stands out to me is going back to this idea, the labor movement as a real social movement. It's not just about wages and benefits. Obviously those things are important, but it's about a social movement and being a site where working class people can not only just get paid more, but develop culturally, broaden their horizons, become political actors in the full sense of the word. And I think her life was a great example of that. Here was a working class Black woman who through the union, is leading educational initiatives, getting involved in the arts, traveling around the world. And I think it would be hard to find another institution another interracial institution during this time period that could offer a working class Black woman that kind of opportunity to develop her capacity. And I think that's what it was about for her. It's not just about the dollars and cents, but literally developing working class people to their full potential. And, so I think I think the kind of lesson there, and as we're talking about Striketober and where do we go from here with the labor movement, it's unions, for me, why I care so much about them is I think they're actually a really critical part of civil society and our democracy. And I'll tell, a little anecdote, I went, some of you might know, Kellogg's workers are on strike. And there's a plant in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I went and visited it to the picket line. And I know definitely not all the workers, but at least few of the workers were Trump supporters. And I knew just by that car as it drove away. And the reason I'm mentioning that is it's okay, in that moment, at least, because of the union, they were involved in a progressive activity, at least for that moment. It doesn't mean, of course, that would change all their views politically, but I feel like there are so many people out there where it's without a union or something like that as a base in civil society, that's might be the only thing tethering them to a progressive vision, or might be the only thing forcing them to unite, even if it's temporarily, with someone of a different race for a common goal. And so I think, that's kind of a lesson for unions. And I think the other thing from Maida is, I think teaching us the really close connection, both historically and presently, between labor and civil rights. And I get kind of frustrated today where sometimes hear people talk about unions like that's just a thing for white men. And, first of all, the data actually shows today Black people are statistically more likely to be in a union than any other racial or ethnic group. But even, historically, like what we think of as a modern civil rights movement, a lot of those methods and strategies were being used first by Black people, in the labor movement. And I think we got to take into account labor when we're talking about racial justice. And I think today, one of the biggest threats I see to racial equality or, racial justice is the attack on the public sector workers and public sector unions. And, think about how many middle-class Black communities have been built on the backbone of public sector work. So whether that's like teachers, postal workers, city workers, federal government workers, this is kind of the last sector where there's a lot of unions left. And it's a sector that I would argue Black workers disproportionately depend on as compared to white workers. And I think sometimes that kind of gets lost, when we've been talking about Black Lives Matter, especially in these last 2 years, with the wave of protests. And I think we just can't lose sight of that. We can't say that Black Lives Matter in one realm and then be supportive of, austerity and cutting budgets and what that's going to actually do to average working class Black people. So, I think those are kind of some lessons that from her life that we can think of today, think about why was her union, the Garment Workers Union, we talk about this vibrancy. It wasn't just that people were getting paid more, but it's like, wow, in this union, I have a whole new social world that's opened up to me. I can do stuff I could never have imagined before because of what this organization has done. And I think that's kind of how we can energize the labor movement again, I would hope in the future.
Yeah, thank you for that great piece, Paul. So the organization I couldn't think of before was the Coalition of Black Trade Unions that Oralee Malone helped to, she's a founding member of that, as well as the Coalition of Labor Union Women. So she had a very intersectional approach. And so I think that, what we have to do, what all social movements should be aware of is the need to be very inclusive of all genders and races, and see that as a strength, because we see women now in the leadership of many labor organizations, and they are doing phenomenal work. And people like Oralee Malone are committed, their whole lives to organizing, and they don't get the kind of support that they should have gotten during their lifetime. So I think that we need to tap into that kind of energy that they're giving and support these new voices that are coming forth. I would also say that, one thing that Maida had that I think is very hard for me even to embrace is to be diplomatic. To know how to talk to people to get them on your side eventually, because she had to talk to a whole bunch of people who were just straight up racist. You talk about the Trump supporters, not saying that all Trump supporters are racist or anything, but, she would have to talk to people who, a shop chairman who spat on her floor because he saw her as a Black woman in a position of power and he was disgusted, but she would still have to relate to that guy, and so, sometimes I think that we don't appreciate what people before us have struggled with, some of the challenges that they've had that didn't, and that they didn't let those challenges get in the way of their commitment to a larger vision. And that is very difficult, and I think that is her strength, that she was able to do that, not lose that vision in the face of a lot of oppression and a lot of derogatory behavior that was meted out toward her.
Thank you, and pass it to Christina for our final word of the night.
And again, I have to always extend my absolute profound and deepest gratitude to Dr. Yevette RIchards for persevering and capturing my grandmother's story in both of her books. We are indebted to you in so many ways for saving her story from obscurity, and so grateful, and to thank you for always being willing to come out to lift her up, and to Paul for finding the story again and putting it out there so that it gets remembered again by a whole new group of people and bringing it forward. So grateful to you, and to you, Chris, and Paul Robeson House, and to Radical Black Women for, I'm so grateful and I'm so humbled to be here. Anytime I get a chance to lift her up in light and to elevate her is a glorious day for me. So thank you again from the bottom of my heart. So incredibly grateful. Okay. My takeaway is I've been writing a lot about family and the holidays recently, and I love the holidays because I get to spend more time with my family, and that's not always the case for a lot of people. So I've been writing about that, and in the process of writing about that, I read this great article by Haley McEwen that was published in Africa Today, and she said, nuclear family supremacy functioned as a form of cultural imperialism, which attempted to destroy indigenous societies, beliefs, and knowledge systems through re-education of people into Western gender roles and gendered divisions of labor within public and private spaces. And that really jumped out at me, especially in preparation for coming here tonight, because a lot of, I think, what my grandmother did was create family or kinship circles where they were missing, and she created a sense of that immutable bond wherever she went, with the express purpose and understanding that that harmony in the hearth extended outwards to fortify and foster a desire to work for the greater good. And in that way, she was a uniquely female or femme-identified organizer, in that she listened to people. She heard what their needs were, and she set about and acting trying to cause those needs to be met. And so what I learned from her really, and I think that's something that we can all take to heart, is that community, when organizing, whether it's in labor circles or it's in social justice circles, and hopefully those circles come together and unite even more, is that community is not so much something that you find or participate in, that community is something that you actively create, no matter where you are in the world. You create those circles around you, those extended circles, those bonds, where you are all working together for a common goal, and you cause that to come into being based upon understanding the needs.
That is a beautiful sentiment to, bring this rich, very rich, expansive conversation, many different connections, and almost a century of experience that we sort of like talked through this evening. So just want to, thank you all again, Paul, Dr. Richards, Christina, for being with us. Shout out to Claudia Jones School of Political Education and Dante for really helping a lot with technical assistance for the night. Check out Black Women Radicals tweets. Like Jamie on live tweets is amazing. So he also have a great summary happening on Twitter. And that last piece about community just reminded me of this, Gwendolyn Brooks' poem as a tribute to Paul Robeson, this reminder that we are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. And I think Maida Springer's life and organizing and building community and reaching across, both, political borders and boundaries really spoke to that. So thank you all for joining us. Thanks everyone for watching. You can find this conversation up on YouTube. We'll archive it there. Yes, thank you again. And everybody have a great night. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Ooh, that was great, y'all. That was amazing. That was amazing. Yeah.